The Vikings spent their lives surrounded by ways to die: axes, drowning, freezing, starvation, the open sea itself. But the ones who survived every one of those battlefields often met their actual end somewhere far stranger and far more mundane. Some of them walked through decades of warfare and came out the other side, men who outlasted campaigns that killed everyone standing next to them. What actually killed them afterward was rarely as dramatic as the wars they survived. 6 men built reputations across the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries as some of the most feared warriors in Northern Europe. Each of them cheated death on a battlefield more than once. What finally caught up with them ranged from a dead man's tooth to a scheduling mistake, and in one case, nothing at all: 9th century Orkney. Sigurd Eysteinsson, known as Sigurd the Mighty, had already carved out an earldom through raw force, fighting his way across the north of Scotland until his name alone emptied villages before his ships ever reached the shore. He was the second Earl of Orkney, inheriting the title from his brother Ragnvald and expanding it far beyond anything the islands had seen before. In battle after battle, against Picts, rival Norse settlers, and local lords defending their own land, he walked away. Then came a duel that should have been just another victory. Sigurd challenged a local Scottish leader named Mael Brigte, nicknamed the Bucktooth for his single protruding tooth, to a 40-man versus 40-man duel. Sigurd cheated, bringing 80 men instead of 40. Mael Brigte's smaller force was slaughtered, and Sigurd, as was custom, cut off his enemy's head and strapped it to his saddle as a trophy for the ride home. The same tooth that gave Mael Brigte his nickname scraped against Sigurd's leg as the severed head bounced against his thigh with every stride of the horse. There was no bandage for it at the time, no understanding of infection, just a warrior riding home with a trophy and a scratch he assumed meant nothing. The wound turned septic within days. Sigurd died in the same year as the duel, according to the Orkneyinga saga, somewhere around 892. He was buried near the site of the fight, in what is now known as Sigurd's How. A man who had conquered enough of Scotland to establish an entire earldom, gone because of a piece of enemy anatomy he never bothered to treat. 11th century. Harald Sigurdsson, later called Harald Hardrada, meaning hard ruler, spent nearly 2 decades as a mercenary and commander for the Byzantine Empire before he ever became a king. He fled Norway as a teenager after a failed battle, made his way east, and rebuilt himself entirely as a foreign soldier of fortune. He fought in Sicily, put down rebellions in Bulgaria, campaigned in the Caucasus, and served in the elite Varangian Guard in Constantinople, a unit whose job was to die protecting emperors when court politics turned violent, which happened often. He was imprisoned at one point on accusations tied to a Byzantine power struggle, escaped, and kept fighting anyway, eventually amassing enough wealth and reputation to return north and buy his way onto a throne. By the time he returned north to claim the Norwegian throne, Harald had already survived more warfare than most commanders would see in 3 lifetimes. In 1066, he led an invasion of England, landing his army near York with a plan to take the whole kingdom. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, expecting an easy resupply meeting rather than a fight, Harald left his mail armor on the ships. King Harold Godwinson's English army arrived instead, marching nearly 200 miles in under 5 days to catch the Norwegians completely unprepared. Harold fought without the armor that had covered him through Byzantine campaigns, Sicilian sieges, and years of open warfare across the Mediterranean. An arrow struck him in the throat. The man who had outlived the brutal survival odds of the Varangian Guard, who had marched with armies through terrain that killed most soldiers before they ever reached a battlefield, was gone within moments of the fighting starting. Not from a rival army's strength, and not from being outmatched. From a coat he left on a ship because he didn't think he'd need it that day. Scandinavia and Ireland, 9th century. The sons of Ragnar Lothbrok built an empire out of terror, and their father's reputation preceded all of them wherever they landed. According to saga tradition, Ragnar had raided across Francia and England for years, once besieging Paris itself and extracting a massive ransom in silver from the Frankish king just to make him leave, evading capture repeatedly along the way, until a shipwreck off the Northumbrian coast finally put him in the hands of King Egil. Egil didn't execute Ragnar with a blade. He had him thrown into a pit of venomous snakes, where, according to the sagas, Ragnar composed a death poem as the bites accumulated. His sons didn't take the news quietly. Ivar the Boneless and his brothers assembled what chroniclers called the Great Heathen Army, and invaded England specifically to settle the account. The saga claims Egil was eventually captured and killed using the blood eagle, a ritual execution said to involve carving the ribs away from the spine and pulling the lungs out through the back to resemble spread wings. Modern historians remain divided on whether the blood eagle was ever a real practice or a literary invention, added centuries later by writers who never witnessed a Viking raid firsthand. What isn't disputed is the scale of what followed. The Great Heathen Army occupied large parts of England for over a decade. Ragnar's death came not from combat, but from what he couldn't outsail: a storm, a wrecked ship, and a king with a taste for symbolism over quick execution. The raider who spent years evading capture across two kingdoms lost everything to bad weather and worse luck: Denmark, England, and Norway, early 11th century. Cnut the Great inherited a war from his father Swine Forkbeard, and turned it into an empire far larger than anything Swine had managed. He conquered England outright in 1016 after years of campaigning, took the Danish throne following his brother's death, and later claimed Norway as well, ruling three kingdoms simultaneously through a careful mix of battle, bribery, strategic marriage, and the occasional execution of anyone who threatened the arrangement. For most of his adult life, Cnut was either fighting a war or actively preparing for the next one. He also became famous for a moment that had nothing to do with combat. According to the 12th century chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, Cnut had his throne carried to the seashore and commanded the tide not to rise, not out of arrogance, but to prove to flattering courtiers that even a king had limits. The tide, naturally, ignored him. Cnut spent his final years not on a battlefield, but managing an empire from a palace, dividing his time between Winchester, Denmark, and diplomatic trips as far as Rome. He died in 1035 at Shaftesbury, of what chroniclers describe simply as illness, somewhere between 35 and 40 years old. A man who had conquered three kingdoms through violence was taken down by something no army could stop and no sword could touch, and buried quietly at Winchester Cathedral rather than on any field of battle. Francia and the Mediterranean, 9th century. Bjorn Ironside, said in the sagas to be another of Ragnar's sons, raided along the Seine and pushed a fleet deep into the Mediterranean, attacking targets in Iberia, southern France, and reportedly Italy. Medieval sources claim his fleet mistook the Italian city of Luni for Rome itself and sacked it under false pretenses. A raid built entirely on a navigational error. The Seine campaign alone lasted for months, with Bjorn's fleet extracting massive ransom payments from Frankish rulers desperate to make the raiding stop. A strategy that worked temporarily and then failed the moment the fleet ran low on supplies again. Unlike his brothers, sagas and later Scandinavian sources suggest Bjorn eventually returned home and became a ruler in Sweden, founding what some later medieval genealogies claim was a royal line, living out his remaining years there rather than dying abroad in a Frankish field or a Mediterranean port. The details of his final years are thin, and much of his later life sits in the gap between saga tradition and pure speculation. What the sources agree on is the absence of a dramatic battlefield death. A raider who spent years attacking fortified cities across three regions, who survived campaigns that killed most of the men who sailed with him, appears to have simply gone home and grown old. No poison, no infected wound, no arrow to the throat. Just a slow ending. One of the only outcomes none of the others on this list got to have: Norway and northern England, 10th century. Erik Haraldsson, known as Erik Bloodaxe, earned his nickname the traditional way, reportedly by killing several of his own brothers to secure the Norwegian throne. He ruled through terror rather than loyalty, and when the Norwegian nobles finally had enough, he was driven out entirely, forced to rebuild his reputation from nothing. Erik didn't retire from violence after losing his kingdom. He crossed to England and carved out a new position as King of Northumbria, ruling from York not once but twice, losing the throne and reclaiming it in a cycle most exiled kings never survive even once. Each time he found new allies, new soldiers, and another way back into power, backed at various points by the political chaos of a divided English kingdom, eager for a strong hand in the north, even a foreign one with a violent history. His second reign in York ended in 954, when English authorities finally moved to eliminate him for good. Ambushed at Stainmore in the Pennines, While attempting to consolidate his position, Erik was killed alongside several of his allies in a fight where he had no advance warning and no chance to prepare. The man who had murdered his way to two separate thrones was brought down not in open battle, but in a trap laid specifically because open battle against him kept failing. 6 men, 6 different empires of violence, 6 different final moments that had almost nothing to do with the wars that made them famous. A scratch from a dead man's tooth, an arrow finding an uncovered throat, a pit of snakes waiting after a shipwreck, an illness that outpaced an empire, an ambush that succeeded where armies hadn't, a quiet old age that broke the pattern entirely. Every one of these men understood combat better than almost anyone alive in their era. They understood shield walls, ambushes, sieges, and the calculus of when to fight and when to run. None of that training accounted for a scavenged tooth, an unworn coat, a shipwreck, a fever, or a trap set by enemies who had finally learned that meeting them in open battle wasn't working. The battles were the part everyone remembers, retold in sagas and carved onto runestones for centuries after the fact. The ending was usually something else entirely, smaller, stranger, and far harder to turn into a legend.